local taxes on poor relief was seen to be so important. Bentham wanted to develop a more efficient and more rational system of relief. And it's in many ways the Benthamite vision that wins out, not least because the key architect of the new Poor Law was Edwin Chadwick, and Edwin Chadwick was a pal of Jeremy Bentham. So the new Poor Law, the reformed Poor Law that is finally introduced in 1834, and introduced in the very same pattern, i.e. the holding of a commission, the Poor Law Commission, the suggestion of legislation, the passing of legislation, the creation of a central commission that would then regulate the operation, and the introduction of inspectors. All of these things happen with the new Poor Law for the first time. What it does is try and make poor relief a deterrent. Okay? So it's a more punitive disciplinary system. And its aim is to try and make the poor industrious, liberal individuals, people who can do the work to look after themselves. And in doing that, you can see that what it does is says, well, look, poverty is not about the inability of the market to provide people work or provide people good enough wages to be able to live on. Poverty is about the individual moral failing of the pauper. The pauper lacks the moral character and the self-discipline to be able to support themselves. So to solve this problem, what they came up with was the abolition of so-called outdoor relief, where under the old system you could be given a supplement to your wages or simply poor relief to continue to live in your home with your family. Instead, what you had was the creation of a new type of incarceration in a workhouse, what became known as a workhouse, where the sexes were segregated, families were broken up, and the conditions within the workhouse, as you can tell from your reading, and I hope you get through that piece because it's terrific, are less eligible, where you had to create less eligible conditions than those outside. In other words, you had to make the conditions inside the workhouse an active deterrent for people wanting to claim poor relief. So the second key element about the new Poor Law is its design. Okay? Not just the new type of ideology that it's projecting upon the poor, but the way in which the system operated. So as I said, you have the Central Poor Law Commission, and what it does was take away poor relief from the church. The Anglican Church and parishes had been the basis for the distribution of poor relief in the Elizabethan Poor Law that ran up to 1834. Now, what Chadwick and his commissioners did was create a new administrative unit known as the local union, a poor law union, that collapsed several parishes off them together and created a new figure who would administer that space, the Poor Law Guardian. Now, guardians had to own their own property or be magistrates until 1894. And it was only after 1894 that those qualifications were removed and anyone could be elected a poor law guardian. But the key point was that these guardians were elected officials. Okay, so the point I'm trying to get here is you have a new centralised system where the Central Poor Law Commission at the heart of Whitehall can say, okay, this is the conditions you have to have in your workhouses. Okay, these are the regulations. We have inspectors that are going to come around and check how much you're feeding them, how much you're making them work, whether you're segregating them, etc., etc., etc. But the implementation of those central regulations is delegated to locally elected officials. Okay, so when I said at the very beginning there's a dialectic of centralisation, but then a reanimation of local structures, this is a good example of that. And obviously, the election of poor law guardians becomes quite heated. The other way in which you can think about centralisation is in the actual design of the workhouses themselves, that were based around Bentham's very idea of a panopticon, of having a centralised space that could view and monitor and survey the activities of people right across the system. And it took a variety of different forms. In prisons like this, which is Strangeways Prison in Manchester, you can see very clearly there's a central observation tower. You could have buildings like this, or more usually, you could have layouts like this, where like H-block buildings, basically, which became a big deal, where every ward was easily accessible to the people who worked there. By 1860, 60% of poor law unions had built new workhouses to incarcerate the poor, but only 60%. And, so it's on the slide that I can't see because I can't turn my head, and the other key element here is that despite this new type of central power, local election meant that by the 1890s, 76% of poor law unions were still providing outdoor relief. They're still doing the very thing that the new poor law set up in 1834 to eradicate, often because they hadn't built a workhouse, or the workhouse that they'd built was simply not big enough to hold all the paupers under their charge. Okay, my next example. Public health. Edwin Chadwick has got his, I shouldn't say dirty little hands, because I'm sure they were impeccably clean and sanitary. But Chadwick is a key figure here, and this is why, again, I'm trying to draw these parallels between the poor law and the introduction of public health. Chadwick writes this famous report on sanitary conditions, using new forms of social observation, social reporting, and statistics. And what he does is then, just as he had with the poor law, become like the expert on sanitary measures. He becomes a key part of the Health of Towns Commission, set up by the government in 1844, and then that leads to recommendations, some of which are implemented in the Public Health Act of 1848. Now, the sanitary conditions of the urban industrialising areas were grotesque. The environmental pollution of industrialisation, the degree of poverty, of slum housing, of open sewers, of no running waters. Britain was unsanitary horror, and mortality rates were very high in cities as a consequence. So sanitation was a big issue. But, again, what Chadwick does was detach those sanitary conditions from an understanding of their relationship to economic life. Instead, again, sanitation became something that was primarily about urban design, the unplanned nature of urban design, or about the failings of individual moral character. Only the truly illiberal, unpleasant, abject individuals could live in these types of sanitary conditions. So you can see from this quote from Chadwick's report on sanitary conditions, the removal of noxious physical circumstances and the promotion of civic, household and personal cleanliness are necessary to the improvement of the moral condition of the people. There's a direct correlation between sanitary condition and whether you are a good moral person. To be free in this sense was to be sanitary. And to be unsanitary, to be dirty, smelly, was to be a moral evil that required active government intervention. So again, the same system is introduced as with the Poor Law. You have a new Board of Health established, and then the formation of local boards of health. Okay? This was set up by the legislation of 1848, but local boards of health were only set up if 10% of the local population asked for one. Okay? So it was an adoptive, a voluntary measure. You had to choose to buy in, unless your local death rate exceeded 23 per thousand. If your death rate exceeded that amount, you had no option. The state would insist you would have a local board of health. And basically, in the 1860s and 1870s, that voluntary framework becomes more tenuous, and more forms of compulsion are introduced. In 1866, the Sanitary Act, the Public Health Act, basically makes those local boards of health responsible for the building and the provision of sewers, underground sewers, of provision of clean water and of street cleaning, and insisted that all houses had to be connected to the sewer system. So one of the key things that happens in 19th century cities is the big construction of this new type of sanitary infrastructures, of drains and sewers, of reservoirs that were going to provide clean water, of public urinals, like the one you see before you, of discrete burial places, of abattoirs out of the site of the street, the widening and lighting of streets, the prevention of noise, the measuring of air quality, etc., etc. All of these things became under the rubric of the public health measures. Yes. This would be paid partly by grant from central government, but mainly through local taxation. Okay? So the construction of every reservoir, for instance, was obviously a heated thing, not just because of the environmental impact on the valley flooding, but also the issue of payment. Now, the last thing that I wanted to say about this is that what this did was create a new environment, if you like, in which one had to perform being sanitary. That new standards and codes of behaviour were created. So I'm going to give you the example of urinating, because it's my favourite. Still to this very day, my people are immensely fond of urinating on the street in public places. Okay, despite over 150 years of being told that they have to go into what we here call urinals, but what in England we call urinals. The point is, after the beginning of the spread of public, and now I'm confused what I have to say, urinals, it became increasingly unacceptable to be seen to be urinating in the street or in a public place. Okay? And it was absolutely unacceptable to do it in the park. You'd be chased around the park by the park keeper. That created a new code of behaviour and a new type of regulation in which it wasn't simply the state, the police or the park inspector or whoever it was that would be running chasing people that were peeing in public places. The sense of condemnation came from you, came from the understanding that the rest of society had that it was no longer acceptable to pee in a public place. So this is a very, very good example of the way in which rule becomes internalised by people. That state action that seems disinterested and scientific actually inculcates new ways for people to behave. It helps propagate, if you like, this new type of ideal liberal person. Deep breath. Actually, it's probably best not to take a deep breath in this room with no windows. I'm sure that Edwin Chadwick would have something quite horrible to say about the sanitary conditions of this room. If any of you get a virus or get the flu that's going around everywhere in the next few days, please make a point of not coming to class, because I suspect if you did, we'd all be sick the following week. Anyway, so let me just wrap up what I've been trying to say. I've been trying to say, look, that a new type of modern state emerges in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century. And it came from two places. It came from the first place from having to solve a new problem, which was the problem of governing in a society of strangers, governing when you don't know the people that you have to rule over. And that this creates a new centralised, bureaucratic form of state authority. That was the first impetus. The second was that enlightened, radical critique of old corruption, of the inefficient, wasteful, expensive nature of a state that depended upon administrators who were placed there by their patrons. And in their place, you get the emergence of this idea of a new disinterested, objective science of government that was beyond politics, beyond the interests of individuals. This, I'm suggesting, enabled Britons to trust the state, trust the enormous incursions into their everyday life that the state was increasingly making. And I've been suggesting that there was something of a hierarchy in the way in which the application of government in everyday life occurred. So, if you met the standards of being a good liberal person, you were sanitary, you were industrious, you supported your family, you read your newspaper, you kept yourself informed, then largely the state left you alone, although, as we can see with the case of the urinal, that there would be new environments that would enable you to propagate good sanitary habits and good reading habits and many other things that will come across in future lectures. Basically, you were promised to be left alone by the state. On the other hand, if you were one of those people who failed to be a good liberal person, if you were thought to be lazy or indigent, if you were a bad moral character, if you were dirty, if you were ignorant, if you were a criminal, the full force of the state, very often, in the new forms of incarceration that occurred around prisons, workhouses, schools, etc., 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 became the place for you. And so you have the irony that this new type of liberal state wants to make people free, wants to emancipate people, but it does so by actually giving them more government. So liberalism that I'm talking about is not the absence of government. It's not about making the state small. It's about the proliferation of government, and proliferation of government in all areas of social life. But, again, I don't want you to think of this as simply a one-way street. I've been trying to emphasise, and particularly with the example of the Poor Law and local sanitary measures, that often the way in which these were introduced was by creating local representative structures. You had this strong central component, but then you had these local systems, local structures, that enabled local people to be part of its administration. Okay, so local government, the personal authority of people in localities, whether it was the JP, the magistrate, or the Poor Law guardian, or even the sanitary inspector, continue to be hugely important. So for many people, the state was not this faceless bureaucratic machine, but actually was someone that they still encountered, albeit in different ways, as a human being. Now, on Thursday, what I'm going to look at is how the new science of political economy does a very similar thing to the nature of economic life itself. And so we'll look at the development of ideas of the free market and how they come to help fashion a new type of liberal person as well. Thank you for your patience.